It is often said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Many, for this reason, have remained doubtful of the resurrection as described in the New Testament. However, recent scholarship shows that multiple historical documents outside the Bible support the resurrection. These 2,000-year-old documents, according to renowned Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, closely align with the Christian narrative, even though they were written by trusted historians who weren't Christians. Who were these historians from the first century? And how do their writings support the biblical narrative? Join us as we examine the claims of these trusted documents and the truths they reveal about the resurrection. Ancient secular accounts about Christ. While many scholars argue on whether Jesus was resurrected, a huge chunk of them agree that Paul's letters and the Synoptic Gospels are valid historical documents. This means they are authentic, credible, and consistent to a good degree. But to make a compelling case for the resurrection, we will have to explore documents outside the Bible that tell the same story. These documents have to be written by trusted historians from the first century who didn't believe in Jesus. This way there would be less room for biases and misconceptions. This leads us to the written works of three trusted historians: Publius Tacitus, Flavius Josephus, and Gaius Plinius Secundus, also known as Pliny the Younger. Each of their writings is almost 2,000 years old. Though these historians come from different backgrounds with different stories, they share one thing in common: not one of them is a Christian. Recent scholarship shows us that Josephus was not a fan of Christianity, Tacitus found the religion abominable, and Plinius had many of them executed for refusing to reject Christ. But despite rejecting the faith, their writings have uncovered the truth about the resurrection. To discover what it is, we have to examine the lives of each of these historians and all their works of literature. Then we will examine everything they wrote about Christ and his followers, extract the historical facts and explain each of them through the biblical narrative. We will show how each of their writings aligns with the resurrection story, giving compelling proof for the event through valid historical methods. So without further ado, let's get to it. Josephus the betrayer. If many were to think of a character from the Bible that is best known for selfishness and betrayal, there is no doubt that Judas's name would come up. Famous for his greed-driven betrayal of Christ, the complex nature of this character has intrigued storytellers and theologians for decades. But to uncover the truth about the resurrection, we have to examine the life of another betrayer. Unlike Judas, this man didn't just give up his master for personal gain, but his entire nation. This man was none other than the famous Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He was born 4 years after the death of Christ, into a home situated in Jerusalem. Unlike most Jews, Josephus was born into a wealthy, aristocratic family led by a priest with connections to the Jewish elite. Thanks to this great privilege, Josephus was well educated in Jewish law and Greek culture. He was also blessed with a creative mind and a rare ability to articulate the most complex thoughts and concepts through writing, a skill that would prove useful much later on. Throughout his life, Jerusalem was under Roman rule, one that resulted in increased tensions between rebels and authorities. These tensions would culminate in a great war between the Jews and the Romans, one of which Josephus became a part of. By 66 AD, Flavius Josephus had become involved in the war against the Romans. Thanks to his creative tendencies that proved useful on the battlefield, he was appointed as a commander in Galilee. On a most crucial day during the conflict, the task fell on Josephus to organize the Jewish armies against the Roman forces. But right when the Jews needed him to be most focused and resilient, his mind was plagued with visions of the people's worst fears. Still, he pressed on, but his lack of focus led to a failed defense at the city of Jotapata by the following year. Then he surrendered to the Romans to everyone's surprise. But given the punishment that awaited him if he refused, the Romans couldn't blame him for betraying people. At the time, rebels were being punished by crucifixion, the most cruel punishment reserved for the worst of criminals. With this in mind, Josephus urged the Jews who were hell-bent on fighting the Romans to stop. But they refused, mounting curses on Josephus for turning away from his people. Later on, he would reveal the visions that plagued him for several months in his writings, stating that on many occasions he saw the city of Jerusalem getting destroyed by the Romans not long after. After his surrender, Josephus was taken away by the Romans to the future Emperor Vespasian. Clever with words, Josephus told him about his vision, implying that Vespasian would be the future emperor as he hoped, and also the one who would bring Jerusalem to its knees. At a time when a ruthless and dangerous young emperor was in power, this vision tickled the ears of the ambitious Vespasian. Captivated by the sweet words of Josephus, he decided to keep the previous Jewish commander alive for the time being. Luckily for Josephus, his alleged visions would come true in the coming years. Vespasian successfully became emperor and went on to bring Jerusalem to its knees by the following year. As a reward, Josephus was given Roman citizenship, adopting the emperor's family name for himself, Flavius. Thanks to his quick-witted personality, he was appointed as a close advisor to the Roman rulers. In his free time he would write several brilliant works of literature, with some still being studied today. Perhaps his most popular work was the Jewish War, completed 5 years after Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. His second most notable work, Antiquities of the Jews, was written almost 20 years later. This covered the history of the Jewish people from the earliest times in the Old Testament to his era. In an attempt to justify betraying his people, Josephus also wrote an autobiography, finishing his work in 100 AD before passing away a few months later. Though he would be remembered as a controversial figure who sold his soul to the enemies of his people, the late historian left a rich legacy of Jewish history from a more secular perspective. So, what does any of this have to do with Christ and his resurrection? Well, in his book Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus made 2 references to Jesus. The first of the 2 is written in the 3rd chapter of the 18th volume. The passage implied that there was a wise man named Jesus who did wonderful things. People from different places were drawn to him, believing he was the promised one they had been waiting for. He was condemned to death by the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, but allegedly appeared to those who put their faith in him. The passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, has been rejected by many scholars, who felt like it sounded too favorable to Jesus. This was because Josephus was not a Christian, so it seemed out of character for the secular historian to write about Christ in such a positive way. Christian historians refute this by stating Josephus was only echoing what the Christians believed about Jesus, and not what he thought. Also, keep in mind that Josephus was born about 4 years after the death of Christ, so there would have been a lot of things left out if he wrote about Jesus based on his perspective alone. As a historian, Josephus sought to include most of the things that made Jesus special, especially from the Christian perspective. However, his true opinions would be expressed in the 9th chapter of the 20th volume, where he mentioned Jesus as the brother of James, an outspoken believer who was killed for his claims about Christ. This passage is accepted by many more scholars as authentic, as it aligns more closely with Josephus's stance as a non-believer. But this is what makes it interesting. Despite not being a Christian based on his writings, we can be sure of a few things that align with the story of the resurrection. First, that Jesus was a historical figure and not a myth. Second, that Jesus was known for extraordinary things. Third, many people believed they saw Jesus alive after his death. Lastly, some of his followers were so sure that he resurrected that they were willing to die for it, with James, his brother, being a prime historical example. In the years following Josephus's death, a more trusted historian tells us a similar story about Christ and his followers. Let's find out what he said. Tacitus the cold-hearted. If anyone can be trusted to handle the facts of history with the utmost care, it has to be Tacitus. Known for his great attention to detail and perfectionism, this man successfully played major roles in Roman rule and history. He is widely regarded as one of the greatest historians of ancient Rome. Born 23 years after the death of Christ, Publius Cornelius Tacitus grew up in the Roman province of Gallia Narbonensis. His effective critical mind secured him various roles in Roman politics, including quaestor, praetor, and consul. Intrigued by Roman history and current affairs, he used his power to gain access to a wide array of literature that shaped his perspectives and historical records. Among his most brilliant written works was Annals, a writing that focused on the history and political affairs of the Roman Empire from the reign of Emperor Tiberius to Nero. This work had a strong moral undertone, focusing on the increasing corruption of new leaders as time went by, and the decline of Roman virtues with each new emperor. His next notable writing, Histories, focuses on the history of the Roman Empire from 69 AD, also known as the Year of 4 Emperors, to the rise of the Flavian dynasty. It also gave great insight into the long period of chaos that followed Nero's death. Tacitus is often envisioned as a cold and calculating figure, thanks to the incisive and critical nature of his writings. Though his writings have a strong moral undertone, they only stand as a lens through which he saw the world around him. This ethical viewpoint was part of what made him despise Nero, who was known for indulging in harsh cruelty and self-pleasure. So, what does the writing of Tacitus tell us about Christ and his resurrection? In the 15th volume of Annals, Tacitus mentions the early Christians and the many troubles they experienced under Nero, the emperor he despised. He wrote about a great fire that caused great devastation, and Nero's blame on the Christians for the incident. Tacitus referred to the Christians as an abominable group that based their teachings on the instructions given by a criminal who was executed by Pontius Pilate. This passage is widely accepted by scholars because it reflects the cold and concise nature of Tacitus's writings. Unlike the first text from Josephus about Christ, it is unlikely that the passage was added by Christians later on. This is important for many reasons. Despite considering the early Christians an abominable cult, Tacitus's writings confirm two vital things about Christ. First, just like the writings of Josephus, this confirmed that Jesus was a historical figure and not a myth. Second, it confirms that his followers were willing to face the harshest punishments for what they believed, including the death and resurrection of Jesus. Let us examine one more trusted historian who wrote about the same thing. Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a man who served as governor of a region in modern-day Turkey during the reign of Emperor Trajan. During his reign, he wrote about a growing sect of people who were expanding so fast in his province that he didn't know how to address the situation. He mentioned multiple awkward trials he had to work through, though he wasn't even sure of what to do with them. According to a letter he wrote to the emperor, there were multiple legal charges pressed against alleged criminals whose only crime was identifying as Christians. These people were known for worshipping a god they called Christ, so to end the situation he would often tell them to worship a Roman god and curse their god to spare their lives. But to his surprise, too many of them would refuse, preferring to die rather than worship anything other than Christ. All who refused were executed, as the ruler saw their existence as a threat to peace and order. But to be sure of why the citizens thought these people were dangerous, Pliny looked deeper into the matter. Yet he only became more confused. According to what his insiders revealed to him, the only strange thing Christians did was meet at specific locations before dawn to pray and sing hymns to their God. Their religion had nothing to do with crimes deserving death, and this troubled Pliny, who had already executed many of them for crimes they didn't commit. Because of this, Pliny was no longer sure how to handle this group, as his attempts to end the movement only made it spread faster. In response, the emperor advised him not to actively seek them out but to still punish those who were publicly arrested and accused of being Christians. Though Pliny and the emperor gave no direct mention of Jesus by name, the governor's reference to Christ as a god underscores how Christ and the Church were viewed by Roman authorities. The letter by Pliny to the emperor is accepted by most scholars as a valid historical document, further evidence that Christ was a historical figure, with followers willing to die for what they believed was true, despite having every reason not to. Aside from this, Pliny was also famous for describing the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, with his letters being the only eyewitness account of the tragic event. With that said, it's fair to say that his writings can be trusted. So with these records in mind, what new insights do we now have on the resurrection? Do they prove that Christ was resurrected? Stay tuned for the answers and much more. 4 historical truths. Considering the accounts of these trusted historians, renowned Christian philosopher William Lane Craig arrived at 4 compelling arguments for the resurrection of Christ. These arguments are not natural events approved by a wide array of scholars opposed to Christianity. These facts, according to Dr. Craig, are unusual yet provable historical facts that can only be explained by the resurrection. First, we have the empty tomb. Dr. Craig insists it is not irrational to believe that the tomb was empty on the Lord's Day, as it can be explained as a natural event. Although it sounds intriguing, it is also natural to believe that Christ was buried by a member of the ruling class, who was a secret follower of Jesus. It is also natural to believe that the tomb was discovered by women on the first day of the following week, who found it empty and went to tell others about it. These are valid historical claims, unlikely to have been made up as they couldn't work as made-up stories. How so? Keep in mind that as a disciple, it is hard to tell others that Jesus was abandoned by his followers at the time of death and the only person available to bury him was a member of the same group responsible for his death. This would have been an embarrassing story to tell others who wanted to put their faith in Christ, as not even his disciples trusted Jesus when he needed them most. Also, remember that as a first-century Jew, it is hard to tell others that the tomb was discovered by women, whose testimonies were of much less value in those days. If the disciples wanted to make up a story about the resurrection, they would likely not have mentioned women as the first witnesses of the risen Christ. Second, we have the numerous stories of Jesus appearing alive after his death. Many creeds date back to the 1st century, telling of the different times Christ appeared to many individuals and groups. Most of these appearances were to people who had either lost hope or were incredibly hostile to Jesus. While some think these were hallucinations, the shared experiences imply that these people genuinely believed they saw the risen Christ. Third, we have the transformation of the disciples. As the historical accounts imply, the earliest disciples were boldly telling others about Christ's resurrection shortly after his death. This was a far cry from their behavior when he was arrested and killed by the Romans. All his disciples left him, with each looking out for himself while wallowing in fear and despair. Shortly after, they were boldly telling everyone about Christ. According to Craig, the only explanation for this sudden shift in behavior was a major life-changing experience, one which can only be explained by true appearances with the risen Christ. Fourth, we have the emergence of the church. These transformed followers were so sure that they had seen the risen Christ, so sure that they were willing to give up their lives for it. In the face of intense troubles, these brave men and women had everything to lose by telling others that Christ was alive, but they refused to back down, telling everyone about what they saw and heard, down to the bitter end. In essence, Dr. Craig argues that the best explanation for the empty tomb, the earliest records about his appearances, the transformation of the disciples, and the rapid growth of the early church is the resurrection of Christ. However, there have been alternative answers to these historical facts. Let us examine each of them. Different answers and viewpoints. Over the years, different thinkers have come up with alternative explanations for Dr. Craig's 4 historical arguments for the resurrection. The first one proposes that Jesus was not dead when he came down from the cross but was in a deep state of unconsciousness from the shock of immense pain. When he was placed in the cold, dark grave shortly after, he was revived by the cold environment. Wanting to convince his disciples that he had risen from the dead, he escaped and later returned to his disciples, who believed that he had risen from the dead. While this proposal might seem plausible on the surface, it comes with a lot of problems. First of all, being crucified is not a survivable event. The Roman soldiers took extreme measures to make sure their victims were dead, or they would have died for not doing their jobs properly. It is also hard to believe that Jesus, who had just survived getting whipped, beaten, and nailed to a cross, could have rolled off the large stone of the tomb by himself, fought his way through the Roman guards stationed at the entrance, and walked over a long distance into Jerusalem to meet his disciples. Even if he could do all of this, his appearance to his disciples wouldn't be effective, as showing up with a severely broken body would only imply that he was a man in need of medical attention, not their glorious Lord and Savior. Another famous proposal implies that Jesus' body was stolen in secret by his disciples while the guards were asleep. This is perhaps the oldest opposing view to the resurrection, as it was recorded in the Bible. It was told by the soldiers who were in charge of guarding the tomb, stating that they slept that night and woke up to see the tomb empty. But while this explanation has stood the test of time, it is highly unlikely for 2 reasons. First, if you were a Roman guard on duty and you fell asleep, you would be executed. Second, if you were a Roman guard on duty and you fell asleep, how did you know the disciples stole the body? It is absurd to think the guards noticed the disciples coming to steal the body while they were asleep. And even if that were possible, why didn't the guards stop them? While some try to refute this by stating that it was Jewish guards who were stationed at the entrance of the tomb, the same problem would arise, as it is absurd to think the cowering disciples who abandoned Jesus before his death were now suddenly bold enough to bribe the guards into letting them steal the body. Some resort to claiming the accounts came about by hallucinations, but it is unlikely that groups of people would share the same hallucinations of a single person saying the same thing. It is also unlikely that hallucinations would lead to a widespread belief in the resurrection. Most recent proposals imply that the resurrection narrative was a myth that evolved into a religion of its own. But it fails to account for the earliest creeds dating back to a few years following the resurrection. In the first letter to the Corinthians, written by Paul the Apostle in 55 AD, the writer quoted a creed affirming Christ's resurrection and appearances. This implied that the story of Christ's resurrection and appearances was already well known before most of the New Testament was written. The Christian faith in the first century was based on an event and not necessarily a book, as there were thousands of Christians putting their lives on the line before the first book of the New Testament was penned down. So, with everything uncovered so far, does this prove Christ was resurrected? Is it rational to believe Jesus rose from the dead? Based on Dr. Craig's conclusions, the answer to both questions is yes. He believes that through the testimonies of enemies and people who didn't support Christianity, it is rational to believe Christ rose from the dead based on what they wrote. What makes him so sure of this? Let's find out together. A reasonable faith. Dr. William Lane Craig believes that the historical accounts of Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny support all the extraordinary claims surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus. Because of this, Dr. Craig believes Christianity is not marked by blind faith. Its claims, according to him, can be verified through reason and evidence. In his own words, Christianity is a reasonable faith. A close examination of when these books were written indicates that the historians give different records of Jesus and his followers without depending on each other. This stands as proof that Jesus was a historical figure who lived and died on earth, given that his life was documented by people who had no interest in promoting him or his teachings. Tacitus's description of Christ and the Christians does not state that Christ resurrected, but it implies that these followers were so convinced that Christ rose from the dead that they were willing to stay devoted, despite having everything to lose. People simply don't die for what they know isn't true, and the fact that Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny all reference the intense persecution of people who believe Christ was resurrected stands as proof that it most likely happened. Though the Testimonium Flavianum is highly disputed among scholars, many of them agree that Josephus references Jesus as a historical figure who lived, died, and allegedly resurrected days after his death. Plinius's letter to the emperor can be trusted for various reasons. One of these reasons is that it affirms Jesus was worshipped as a god. This aligns perfectly with the writings of the early church fathers, who all believed in the divinity of Jesus. This, to Dr. Craig, supports the belief that the resurrection was not invented much later, but has been a core belief from the 1st century. This proves we have a strong historical foundation for the resurrection, with each of them revolving around the empty tomb, alleged post-mortem appearances, the incredible transformation of the disciples, and the early proclamations of the resurrection. While the writings of these historians do not affirm the resurrection as an actual event, they provide a great foundation for building a strong case. With the historical evidence for the resurrection converging from external, independent accounts with the claims of the New Testament, there is little reason to believe Christianity is based on blind faith. Contrary to what many think, the Christian narrative invites everyone to examine the evidence for themselves, not just to blindly accept whatever it teaches. By this logic, Dr. Craig argues that it is reasonable to be Christian. This was once explained by American philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who went on to explain this in two ways. Firstly, a belief is rational if someone has no reason to doubt it. In this case, if trusted historical sources tell us something happened in the past, then it's reasonable to believe it. But it would be irrational to believe they are all wrong because that belief doesn't match what was observed. With this in mind, saying something is reasonable means that it's beneficial for someone to believe, even if it turns out to be false. Beliefs are not meant to be proven or known with utmost certainty to be true, just as we don't need to be present in history to believe that what has been written about it is true. The person simply needs to be justified in believing it. Even the greatest scientific minds work by this principle. For example, Isaac Newton was right to believe in his scientific work, even though it was later rendered inaccurate by discoveries. However, that doesn't make him irrational to believe what he did. With this logic, Dr. Craig argues that by saying Christianity is reasonable, he is making a modest claim. This means that while Christians cannot prove the resurrection without a shadow of a doubt, we can still give evidence to show why it's rational to believe Christ rose from the dead. All that is needed is to make a simple case and provide historical evidence to support it. This avoids pointless claims and shows humility to those who don't subscribe to it. Furthermore, the Christian faith is more rooted in history than most other religions. It is full of claims that can easily be investigated historically. With this in mind, Craig supposes that if we choose to read the New Testament books as historical documents and not as statements of faith, we would find good reason to trust what it says. In other words, if people give these sacred writings the same amount of grace granted to the documents written by Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny, many would come to accept the historical arguments for the resurrection, even as non-Christians. For nearly 40 years, these arguments have been used by Dr. Craig in his numerous public debates with atheists on the truthfulness of the resurrection, most of which ended in his favor. Among these atheists include notable historians and journalists such as Bart Ehrman, Michael Scherer, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Carrier. Still, it is important to know that most Christians adhere to their faith because of their subjective experiences, and not because of the historical evidence mentioned in this video. The work of Christian philosophers like Dr. Craig goes to show that there are many good reasons to adhere to the Christian faith beyond personal experience. He argues that through the work of trusted historians from the 1st century, we have good reasons to believe that Christ rose from the dead, as written in the Scriptures. So what do you think? Do these documents prove that Christ was resurrected? Do we have enough evidence to support it? Let us know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it ***.